Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Dr. Joan Ricart-Huguet. Hello, Joanne. How are you doing?
Hi, nice to meet you, Lipton.
Nice to meet you too, Joanne. So, Joanne, in America, people usually say Joan, but in Jamaica, we say Joanne. So when I saw the name, I was saying, okay, maybe his name is Joan or it's pronounced in a more sophisticated manner because you're from Europe. But in Jamaica, we usually say Joanne. So it's Joanne. All right.
The Jamaican pronunciation is closer to Catalan than American English. That seems to be the case.
Yes. So, Joanne, we're going to be talking about your paper titled The Origins of Colonial Investments in Former British and French Africa. Joanne, I'm fascinated by the history of colonialism. I've read so many papers on the topic, I've written on the topic, and I continue to interview distinguished scholars like yourself because this issue is quite complicated. There is not a clear-cut answer. One can always argue that because of the right to self-determination, colonialism is morally objectionable. But it's more difficult to posit that on average colonialism was negative or positive. So this is why I'm so interested in the topic. So what motivated your research?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in saying that it's a complicated topic. I think that's one of the reasons people interested in both colonial rule and in self-determination are interested in it, you know. What interested me? Well, honestly, it was it was a bit of a tortuous path towards the paper that you mentioned was part of my dissertation when I was a graduate student. But in short, what interested me is to try and understand how power is allocated in Africa today, and in fact, since independence in the 1960s. I ended up examining the colonial period because, the collection of data and the reading of historical sources led me to understand and to realize something that existing literature paid little attention to, it seems to me, which is that to understand how power in in both East and West Africa, which is the regions that I focused most of my efforts on, to understand how power in, say, from Senegal to Kenya is distributed, especially in the government, meaning in the cabinet. It's not enough to just look at short-term power arrangements. You need to kind of go back in history, and I realized that as I, like I said, as I was reading and looking at historical data, and that led me, to the colonial period. But I don't know if you want me to give you a bit more detail or.
No, that answer was sufficient. So we're going to talk about your paper now. The origins of colonial investment in former British and French Africa. Joanne, what motivated colonial investment?
That's a very good question, because in some sense, one might say, why would, say, the French or the British invest at all, right? Now, there are motivations for colonial investments are multiple once you think a bit more about it. One that will come to mind probably of many people, also if they have the Latin American colonial experience in mind, is resource extraction, right? To extract resources, you do need to invest to some extent, even if it's to just build a railroad or so, right? In the case of Africa, there's also what's called, since 1885 at the Berlin Conference, the principle of effective occupation. And that was the idea that colonial powers, to effectively claim possession of a particular land, they had to, quote unquote, effectively occupy it. In practice, we know from much research that presence on the ground was quite thin, but it was not non-existent, right? So it existed, and one of the reasons it existed is because, the motivations for the imperial expansion of Europe into Africa were not simply economic. In other words, they were not about resource extraction alone, but they also had to do with, imperial status concerns. And so effectively occupying a territory increases, right, the size of the French, the British, German, and so on empire. So these are two important reasons. They're probably not the only ones, but these are two of them.
And when Europeans decided to invest in colonies, what did they look for in the infrastructure?
What do you mean? What did they look for in the infrastructure?
I'm talking about the geographical environment. What did they look for in the what did they look for in the geographical environment? So did they invest in a region because it was conducive to agricultural productivity?
Well, that came later. I see what you're saying now. Well, there's things they looked for and things that they looked to avoid, right? So the first thing they looked for in what's called the Age of Sail, which is basically the period when the Portuguese and then the British started navigating, and then the Spanish down down the coast of Africa, even in the 1400s before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. They looked for places where they could anchor the ships, right, at the very basic level. And that's one of the things I use in the paper. So they look for geography that is, in other words, favorable for anchoring, and then for being able to initially engage in very modest trade, as the Portuguese did before the colonial slavery, before pre-colonial slavery took over. There was modest trade. So that's one thing they looked for, places where they could anchor the ships, in a sense. What were they not looking for in the pre-colonial period and until the invention of quinine? They were trying to avoid places that would have a dangerous disease environment, so of course places near water and the like were ridden with malaria. In fact, of course, some places still are, and so they were trying to avoid some such places. Is that what you have in mind?
Yes, exactly. That's the question. That's why I said, what did they look for in the infrastructure? Maybe I should have said, what did they look for in a controlled environment, or comment on the factor endowments? But yes, you answered the question. Pre-colonial trade. What motivated pre-colonial trade? Because in your paper, you also assert that there is a link between the success of pre-colonial trade and future investment in the colonial era. So what motivated pre-colonial trade in Africa? And I'm directly talking about Africans who are engaging with trade with other Africans.
Well, the most famous pre-colonial trade, at least as far as most of West Africa is concerned, is what has come to be known as the triangle trade between Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And of course, central to the triangle trade was the trading of slaves, right? Where, it's hard to know the exact figures, but over 10 million, right, slaves were shipped from various countries today, right? Like Angola, all the way from Senegal down to Angola across the Atlantic. So, it was not the only trade, by the way, although it was the most profitable and one that overtook and overshadowed everything else. So, of course, trading life is unfortunately very profitable, and so that went on for over 3 centuries. I'm certainly not an expert on the pre-colonial slave trade.
No. The question is not really related to the pre-colonial slave trade. I just wanted some commentary on the geographical endowments that made it easier for Africans to trade, like you mentioned some of them in your paper.
Yeah,
like waterways, etc.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the question is a simple question. You're thinking too deeply.
But yeah, essentially, one of the things that, to summarize, I guess, an answer to your question is that we know historically, if we look at where trade began in West and South, and even though my paper doesn't really cover Southern Africa, but West, South, and even Eastern Africa, these are places that had typically some geographic advantage that facilitated trade between Africans and Europeans. And these advantages were natural harbors, right? Harbors that are naturally conducive to ships anchoring there, or capes. Capes can also provide, some cover for ships. And then sometimes rivers, right? As long as they're deep enough, because sometimes, shallow rivers are not so, so favorable. So these are, in a sense, accidents of geography that explain why Lagos became the capital of colonial Nigeria and not someplace in, in the Niger Delta further, further east in Nigeria. That explains also why in Senegal, the island of Gorée became important for pre-colonial trade, as opposed to some other, area, and so on. Why St. Louis, which has the, the river, became important, and again, not some other area. So these are, important starters, in a sense, that define the early locations where trade is concentrated.
And would you say that Europeans selected for areas in Africa that were already productive?
I have no productive. You mean in terms of agricultural yields, or
Yeah, meaning regions that were more prosperous, they had better infrastructure. So Europeans did not want to invest in regions that were underdeveloped, so they chose the better regions.
Systematically, it's hard to know. And it may be that I simply don't know, or it may be that we, in a sense, more generally scholars, don't know. If you know, you should tell me. But there are examples that can point both ways. So, the Portuguese, as they were sailing down, they established some relations very early on with, with the Kingdom of the Congo. So obviously the Kingdom of the Congo, to the extent that it had, a political hierarchy, it was certainly not an encephalous society. It was a kingdom, right? Then it was presumably more developed than other places, say Eastern Nigeria, which until the 19th century was largely composed of encephalous societies. But these are, of course, just anecdotal examples. I don't know if systematically there was selection on that front. I do not have evidence.
Yes. All right then. In your paper on page 28, you say increasing distance from a pre-colonial trading post reduces all types of investments.
You want me to explain?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's so. So let me preface this by saying, if you you've seen the paper, and maybe you can post some link or something when you post this on YouTube, so that people can see perhaps the map that's in the paper, because essentially investments in the colonial period, and by that I mean the first half of the 20th century, even though some areas like the Gold Coast colony, there was a colony already in the 19th century, but by colonial period, let me simply refer to kind of 1900, 1960, right? Investments were very highly concentrated in areas that were historically pre-colonial trading posts. And these were areas in turn that were typically a natural harbor, a cape, or that were on a river. So there was a very high concentration of investments by the colonial state, right? And when I say investments, I mean therefore public investments, right? Missionaries were also concentrated, as it turns out, in some of these locations, but I focus in the paper mostly on public investments. They were concentrated in those areas. So I mentioned the example of Lagos, Nigeria, right, which became the capital of the colony of southern Nigeria, because Nigeria was two colonies before it became one. So anyway, that's kind of finding number one, if you will, at the descriptive level. That's where you find the investments. That's also where a lot of the money was raised, both from trade tariffs and from Africans who were being taxed, oftentimes disproportionately compared to European settlers, because European settlers had more influence in the colonial state with the colonial governors than did Africans. But that's where you concentrate a lot of the public investments. What you're referring to is that we can find that that as distance increases from these important, typically coastal cities like Lagos, levels of public investment in infrastructure, so roads, buildings, sewage, right? All of what we think of as infrastructure, but also in education and health, all of these decrease very quickly once you move away from these centers. So neighboring districts to what was Lagos would have higher investments than the ones further out, but the decrease is pretty precipitous.
All right then. And Joanne, in your paper, you also write, pre-colonial trade does not increase the likelihood of having a railroad. Expound on this finding, please.
Yeah, so essentially, I mentioned earlier that the conventional wisdom is that to the extent that the colonial state invested in East and West African colonies, this was primarily driven by natural resource extraction, right? And these need railroads. And so what I find is that there's a positive correlation between the location of natural resources and the location of railroads. So that's the positive finding. You were referring to, in a sense, the negative finding, which is that pre-colonial trading centers are very good predictors of investments in infrastructure, health, and education, but they are not good predictors of whether a given district in East and West African colonies has a railroad. Why is that? Presumably because railroads they extend over space, for one, but also because railroads are the one investment that's probably much more extractive, right, than teachers or nurses or doctors would be, right? So railroads in particular likely follow a somewhat different logic than the majority of public investments in infrastructure, health, and education.
Joan, did infrastructure developments like railroads benefit Africa?
That's when you say benefit Africa, you mean
I'm talking about your paper, and if you want, you can comment on Africa more broadly. But there's a big debate on the link between colonial infrastructure developments and contemporary income.
I see. Well, what I find, and I'm not the first one to, for what used to be French West Africa, the groundbreaking paper is by French economic historian Elise Pierry.
Yes, I'm familiar with her.
So in some sense, on that point that I'm going to discuss, my paper builds on hers quite clearly. And of course, I have data for not just for what used to be French West Africa, which perhaps we should clarify was composed by Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mauritania, Cote d'Ivoire, and Benin. That's 8. Good. I got them all. So that's what used to be French West Africa. My paper also includes data on the East and West British colonies. And so this would be Ghana, or then the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and then you also, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania after World War I, Malawi, then Nyasaland, Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia. Okay, so this is, a pretty large data set, given that I have data at the district level, at the colonial district level. And what I find in the paper is that there's a clear correlation, especially between investments in things like education and health, but also infrastructure and levels of development today, right? So parts of the colony where there was more colonial involvement, right, either by the state and or by missionary in some cases, right? They are more developed today. So there's quite a bit of historical persistence in that, to stay with the example of Lagos, if you will, in Nigeria, or say, St. Louis in Senegal. These were areas that were within the colony favored with respect to others. And they have kept their advantage in spite of course, the political instability that has characterized not so much Senegal, but definitely a number of countries like Nigeria, right? Or, Guinea or Kenya. But in spite of this political instability, there's been quite a bit of persistence. And, some people have argued that one of the reasons why these stark inequalities introduced in the colonial period have not been that diminished is because of weak state capacity. So anyway, that's going beyond your question though.
Yes, but I'm also interested in the literature on state capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Joanne,
Mm-hmm.
Baten, that economist, he has a new paper on numeracy and development in Africa. And in this paper, he argues that there's a positive relationship between British colonial investments and numeracy. And Alexander Moradi has a paper on British colonialism and education, and his findings are also positive. In your paper, you note that education and healthcare are positive. Therefore, we ought to invest in education and healthcare, and I agree. But you refer to these investments as non-extractive. So when do we determine that an investment is extractive?
So I'll answer that, but what's the first paper you were mentioning?
Yeah, this is a new paper,
Okay.
George Baten, B-A-T-N. It's a new paper.
Okay, maybe you can send, I haven't read the first one, so maybe you can send it to me afterwards. What determines whether an investment is extractive? Well, that's, the basic kind of distinction between kind of extractive and non-extractive. So extractive investments are typically ones that are designed with the goal of appropriating resources. So, a canonical case, in Africa would be appropriating mineral resources in Southern Africa, right? Or diamonds later on in Sierra Leone or the like, right? So extractive investments typically, don't have any kind of broader purpose that benefits the country in question. Health and education typically are thought of as non-extractive, or at least that's the way I think of them, because it's not money that goes to build a railroad that's going to extract, rubber from Guinea, as that could be the case, but they are instead typically providing a service, whether that be, a nurse or a teacher, right, doctor.
But if the consequences of an extractive investment are positive, then should we still say that it is extractive?
Well, we shouldn't confuse whether an investment is extractive or not based on the consequences. There's a lot of literature, though, suggesting that extractive investments are detrimental, right, for development. So, there's famous papers, in fact, all the kind of Asimoglu and Robinson literature. And
yes, I interviewed James Robinson some time ago, and we discussed that. We discussed his research.
You mentioned that in the email. So, so obviously you're very familiar with that. Or, there's the famous Melissa Dell paper on.
Yes, and she finds positive effects for some of these extractive institutions.
For the less extractive. So, yeah, so, I think the evidence overall is that this extractive aspect of colonialism is quite detrimental because it depletes resources without providing much to, right, the people that are subjugated by, be it, colonial imperial Spain or imperial Britain, whatever empire it may be, right?
It depletes resources using a cost-benefit analysis framework. I think in that sense, it would have depleted resources. But if you're looking at it from a short-term perspective, at that time, it was seen as beneficial.
Of course, it was beneficial for the imperial power. Spain, it was beneficial for Spain in the short run to plunder Latin America. But
Well, Spain,
that came back
Henry,
to bite Spain later on, right?
yes, Henry Kamen, he's a historian, and Henry Kamen and some of his co-academics, they actually argued that the empire was expensive for Spain, and most of the resources that were extracted by Spain did not end up in Spanish coffers. They had to repay bills.
I would need to read that paper,
Yeah,
but
so Henry Kamen wrote several books.
so yeah, you please send me that paper. I would be interested.
Yeah.
Definitely no expert in Latin America. The it's true that in the case of much of East and West Africa, as I mentioned in the beginning of the interview, it was not just economic considerations, right? There were imperial status considerations. And in fact, just earlier this week, I was reading a manuscript by a political scientist at UCLA, Lachlan McNamee. I don't know if you have heard of him, but I'm happy to send you, his website. And in his case, he argues that one of the reasons why some countries cease their colonial effort is because sometimes it's too costly, right? So thinking of this cost-benefit analysis, he argues that that's why Australia gave up on Papua New Guinea. So yeah.
Yeah, so imperialism is an expensive project, and
well, that depends, right? It
there's
depends.
actually
Sometimes
one
it's
study. There's
sometimes
actually one study by William Jervis Clark. Let me get his name properly. William Clarence Jervis. Yes, William Jervis Clarence Smith. There's one study by this academic, and he refutes the argument that imperialism is extractive. But then again, Williams' paper was measuring one specific company that proved to be profitable. But on average, the evidence seems to indicate that imperialism was expensive for Europe, and trade with the non-Western world was relatively unimpressive when you compared the entirety of European trade.
That seems like a bit of an ambitious statement. I don't know.
No, well, Jeffrey Evote Frankima, he did a paper on Africa, and he was looking at the financial benefits of African trade and the scramble for Africa. But in the paper, he also argues that this trade was not the most lucrative trade for Europe. And Azar Gat, who's a historian, he studies war and imperialism and the state, he has also written on the topic. It was profitable, but not necessarily the best trade. There were always other alternatives.
One thing is clear is that, and it is that, the various trading companies, for instance, that Britain established in Africa, from what we know, they were not nearly as profitable as the East India Company, right? So the East India Company, when it comes to to long distance trade and to empire building, was the jewel of the crown, and compared to that, the African ones were minor in volume. That I think that's safe to say.
Yes, you're correct. You're correct on that topic. But moving on a bit,
Sure.
I like this particular question, and you posed it yourself in the article, so I'm going to read it. How did investments diffuse within East and West African colonies from early trading enclave to the rest of the colony?
Well, the short answer is that they didn't diffuse much, right? That's what we were talking about earlier, in that public investments declined quite precipitously as you move away from the colonial capital and from the few districts that contained the bulk of the infrastructure, the bulk of the schooling, right? So take, if you take Uganda, where I have done some work on, for this, but also for other projects, Mengo, essentially think of, the capital Kampala and all the areas around it. Mengo district, a lot of investment were concentrated there. That's where the British, in a sense, made the agreements with the Kabaka, the king of the Buganda kingdom. But, as you move away, there were around 15 districts or so in the 1930s in colonial Uganda. Especially when you move north, it's just a precipitous decline. So again, the short answer is that diffusion was very limited, and in part that's because, as I think I explained in this paper, or if not, there's another paper that's more on the on political issues. But in one of those two or in both, I explain, as others have mentioned already, that Britain and France didn't want the empire to cost them money, except for military issues, where then they were okay financing military conquest, but they didn't really want African colonies to cost them much money, and so that's why investments diffuse very little, because the taxpayers in France and Britain are not really paying for the empire beyond its military dimension, at least not until the end of World War II, where there's what we call the developmental phase of colonialism. But until late in the colonial period, it's, as some people have put it, they were running the empire, as far as East and West Africa are concerned, they were running the empire on the cheap. So investments diffuse very little, because the money comes from a little bit from the metropole, but mostly, as I mentioned earlier, from tariffs, and taxes on Europeans, and especially in Africans. There were poll taxes, head taxes, very regressive, as you know.
Yes, and in some places in Africa, locals were prevented from exporting cash crops.
Well, Kenya is perhaps of the colonies that I study, Kenya is a clear case where you have what came to be known as the White Highlands in central Kenya, fertile areas where a number of, especially British, but not just Europeans, established tea plantations and so on, and enlisted local labor to assist in the production of the crop and so on. So,
all right.
Yeah, of course.
No, this is the final question. Pre-colonial centralization and development. Is there a link? You also control for pre-colonial centralization and investment. So is there a link? And it can be brief.
There are a number of papers that you may have read that seem to show a clear link between levels of pre-colonial centralization, meaning places where there were pre-colonial kingdoms, and levels of economic development today using various proxies, right? Some of these papers are very well done. So, the short answer is that the relationship that I find, essentially, the importance of pre-colonial trade to explain levels of colonial investments across districts, and the importance of colonial investments to explain present-day development across districts, that is not confounded by pre-colonial political centralization. You can control for it, you can slice the data in various ways, right? And what I can show are two things: that pre-colonial kingdoms did not receive a disproportionate amount of investments during the colonial period, so there was not a strong selection in that sense. And second, that even if we account for levels of pre-colonial political centralization, the relationship between colonial investments and current development in Africa remains very positive and significant.
All right, I just wanted to get that clear, because as you said, there is a robust literature on the topic of pre-colonial centralization and modern development. So Joan, it has been a pleasure speaking to you, but these days I'm planning to do shorter shows, and we started the conversation at 5. I like early shows, so because we started at 5, unfortunately I have to wrap up, but I'm going to send you those papers, and it has been a pleasure. Bye, Joan.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, Lipton. Bye.
Yes.